My name is Kofi Kankam. I am one of the founders of Admit Advantage, which is an admissions consulting company servicing people around the world. And we love partnering with Beat the GMAT. This is one of the ones, as I mentioned, we really love doing because there's so much, while there's so much information out there, on sort of the web, it also creates a system where certain false notions can be perpetuated, sometimes by candidates, sometimes by even admissions consultants, and sometimes obviously just, from one person passing it to another person, passing it to another person, certain ideas get perverted. So today we're going to talk about the things that we hear all the time from people. We actually literally keep track of the myths on our own, and we've these are no specific order, but these are literally the top 10 things that people ask us about that they have sort of false ideas about. Okay. So I'm going to speak a little bit on the company, not a huge amount, just enough where you feel like I know what I'm talking about. Make sure you guys feel like I've got some credibility, and then we'll talk about the myths within application criteria, choosing an MBA program, and the overall application process itself. If you have questions, please try to hold them to the end. If something's really pressing, type it, and I'll try to get to it during the course of the presentation, but there will be ample opportunity on the back end for you to ask questions and for me to answer as many as I can. So a little bit about us. So we are an admissions consulting company, meaning we help candidates basically with everything outside of their GMAT. Okay, so everything related to their overall application strategy to school enrollment is our focus. Our company and our process is going to be very structured. So, we're former scientists that founded the company, and we believe that when people are applying either from places where they're big funnels into business school and or from places where they never send people to business school on the other side of the spectrum, it's really important to pull out individual stories and narratives and accomplishments and leadership characteristics to make your application your own, to have a unique voice. We've also been very fortunate in the last couple of years to have brought on really good people. The economy's worked to our advantage in the sense that there are a lot of good MBA alumni out there who, have been sort of looking for work, not been employed in the kind of work they love, and so we've been able to hire people who not just have great degrees, but are actually great with people, have done this in previous incarnations, and have a great sort of bedside manner. And then lastly, I would say that we've tried to mirror the diversity that we see in our candidates in terms of their career choices as well as career backgrounds prior to school. We've mirrored that in our consulting base. So we have a list of people who are from so many different kinds of industries, including finance, marketing. We've had a speechwriter for Joe Biden. We have a bunch of technology people, obviously consulting, real estate people, different kinds of entrepreneurs. So we have sort of the coverage in the areas that a lot of you look to go, and that's really important from an application standpoint. In terms of our key tenets, it's really experience, client focus, and performance. So in terms of experience, all of us are alums of top-tier schools. We've all gone through a pretty strong, rigorous process. I guess for the founders, sort of just trying to get this company launched, 7 years ago. And most of us have served on admissions committees either as second-year interviewers or alumni interviewers. We're also known to have a very strong client focus. We kind of like to think of ourselves as the Zappos of the admission space. We get invited to a lot of going-away parties, some weddings, and we like that, one, because it makes our jobs more interesting, but also because it creates an environment whereby our clients feel comfortable giving us pertinent personal information that we can sort of weave into the course of their application. And then lastly, all this would be a moot point if our people weren't getting into top programs. So we've been very fortunate to have really good clients. We also think obviously we have a really good process, but most importantly, our people are at all the top tier schools, right? So this is actually just a snapshot. You see your Kellogg, Stanford, Wharton, Harvard, INSEAD, LBS. We've placed people in HKUST, a couple of big Latin American universities. We've had good representation. We're quite proud of it. Okay, I'm Kofi. I've got Eric as well. We're the two founders. It's weird because our careers kind of mirror each other, even though we didn't meet until just about business school, just before business school. We both worked at Accenture. I worked at Net2Phone, which is a predecessor to Skype, much less successful. Eric worked at GE Capital, where he became a vice president. Both of us sold software companies. I did the Wharton Venture Initiation Program. My educational background is from Harvard College. I did my undergraduate degree in neurobiology. I stayed and pursued a master's in education from there, and then went to Wharton, where I met Eric. At Wharton, I was fortunate enough to have a Joseph Wharton Fellowship, which was about $50,000. I ran Wharton's largest student-run conference, and I also served as a marketing teaching assistant for a first-year course. Eric actually had a more impressive background, graduate from Wharton with honors, was a Twigo fellow, had a full ride, and went to Brown University. Both of us have been involved in admissions for our undergraduate and basically graduate MBA program. And the consultants we have are probably even stronger in terms of great representation, great companies like McKinsey and Google and Goldman and GE and organizations like the United Nations. And you can see about 80% of our people on admitadvantage.com/consultants. That's it on the company. Let's get into some of the myths. Let's talk about the admissions criteria, okay? Things we see all the time. So career changers, right? Myth number one, career changers are at a distinct disadvantage. We get this all the time. And the reality is that they're not, okay? A large percentage of candidates applying to business school are career changers. Frankly, that's why a lot of people are willing to incur the cost in terms of money and time to actually go get an MBA. I mean, if people were kind of doing everything they wanted to do in their careers, they wouldn't get an MBA. So you'll find that at most of the top-tier schools, anywhere from 40 to 60, 65% of the people going to school are going distinctly to change careers. And a lot of times, they're wide changes. They're not changes, say, going from accounting into investment banking. They're going from the military into consulting, going from marketing into finance, or finance into sort of data analytics. I mean, they're quite wide swings that people are looking to make. Most business school students also didn't major in business or accounting or finance as undergraduate. You have a lot of science people, you have a lot of humanities people. You obviously have a lot of people with business majors, but it's not the majority. Typically, it's about 30 to 40, 45% in most schools. You are also competing against people with similar backgrounds. So, people often, we get calls all the time, people ask us, I major in English and I basically want to get into consulting. How am I going to beat, the woman that basically, went to Carnegie Mellon and works at Goldman Sachs? Well, guess what? You're not really competing against that person. She's competing against other investment bankers applying to business school. So, don't be concerned about that. And then realize that admissions committee members are looking to build a class with diverse experiences. So they don't want people who are all doing the same thing or who are all doing, now what they look to do sort of going forward. They want people who are switching careers, who've got a different perspective on the material, who, can present to the potential employers new wrinkles on how they would sort of get a problem done based on the fact that they're coming from an alternative industry. Okay, so in terms of our recommendations and advantages, if you need quantitative support, if you don't have basically a lot of quantitative rigor in your background, potentially consider taking classes, right? Really, first of all, go through and evaluate your quantitative background. For a lot of you that have undergraduate degrees in the humanities, you probably got a liberal arts education where you probably had to take some science and math courses. So take a look at that, see if you did that. If you've done that and you've done it well, i.e. gotten, in the B+ and above range, then you're probably covered. If you have you haven't done those courses and or you didn't do them well, consider taking supplemental courses at a local university in like finance, accounting, stats, economics, business math, etc. Okay? Make sure that you're also indicating where you want to go in your career. Okay, so this is, again, it's your career. It's not your first job. So if you're looking to switch careers, that's totally fine. Tell us what the dream is. Okay, tell us what you're looking to do with regard to industry, role/function, title, and hopefully the location. As many of those indices as you're aware of, make sure you're clearly articulating that within the course of your application, including your recommendations. And then make sure you're also beginning to talk to people about careers you have interest in. Make sure that admissions members feel that you understand what it is to be X if you haven't done X. And you can do that very easily. Going to conferences that are offered by the clubs on campus, speaking to student leaders at a particular business school, reaching out to fellow alums of your undergraduate alma maters who are in the industry. Make sure you basically are accumulating information and basically accumulating data and evidence that you're actually showing real interest in making that career shift. You're not just saying that to get into business school. Myth number 2. I don't have a good GMAT score, right? I'm below the median GMAT, and there's no way I'm getting in. Now, look, I'm not going to brass tacks. I'm not going to, lie to you and tell you that GMAT's not important. It is important, and by GMAT, I also mean GRE, by the way. The GMAT is a huge way that schools look to filter candidates, but it's not the only criteria. It really isn't. Now, if you are 100 plus points off the mean, it's probably going to be tough for you to get in school, whatever school you're applying to. But if you're within that range, you may be able to sort of get past a weaker GMAT with having great work experience, having compelling essays, having a really good GPA, where you can sort of say, look, in terms of the GPA experience, idea, look, I'm not a great test taker, but where it really matters academically, I'm a really good student. I've formed student groups. I've done well academically my entire career, and what I did in college mirrors very closely what I'm looking to do in business school in terms of taking classes, being involved in activities, and finding a job. So we've had a number of candidates successfully articulate, why their test score should be sort of minimized, and they've gotten into school, okay? And make sure that you obviously have a great interview, and you also have your recommenders write about some of these things. So for example, if you don't do well on your GMAT in the quantitative section, you probably want your recommenders, you want to signal to them that you want them to highlight your analytical skills, your facility with data, right? Your ability to sort of work out the numbers, the fact that you're sort of an Excel junkie. You want those things highlighted in order to sort of usurp the fact that your GMAT quant section is not good, okay? So again, in summary, take a course. We work with Princeton. We love them. They're very strong. There are other good courses. But if you work with them on our side, you'll get a 15% discount. We get nothing in return, but it's something to consider, okay? Also consider taking the GRE. The GRE is kind of considered to be a little bit easier for most of you because the quant section is not quite as rigorous, all right? Now, you got to look at the schools and see which ones take only the GMAT, but it's an increasing number that are taking the GRE. I think it's somewhere about 1,100 schools globally, so you probably have a pretty good chance of that school accepting the GRE. And then, as I mentioned before, consider taking a class and also push your recommenders to basically address your weaknesses, right? So it's really important to do that. A poor GMAT is not a death knell. If your GMAT is way off the mean, if it's, I'd say, if you're in the 75th percentile in terms of median scores, that can be a little bit scary. If you are 70 plus points off the mean, it can be a little bit difficult, but you see people get in, so it is kind of doable. Okay, so I'm too old or I'm too young. We get this all the time. I literally spoke to 2 or 3 people yesterday that were north of, actually all of them were over 30, but they were below 34, and they basically were concerned that they're just too old to get into school. The reality is that's just not true. Even schools that have, skew a little bit young, they always have older candidates there, okay? There are a couple of things. One, you need to think about what is the right program for you. Is it a full-time? Is it part-time? Is it executive MBA? And you have to be able to articulate why one program makes sense over another program, right? So if you're older than the median, you got to be able to sort of express why an MBA makes sense for you and why now, right? And realize that schools don't want to accept people that are treading water in their career. So they don't want to look at people that are just looking at the MBA as a career reset. And sometimes we see older candidates who say, look, I'm languishing in my career, things aren't going right, I'm 33, I haven't been promoted in 3-4 years, my boss hates me, or I'm unemployed, I'm going to get an MBA. Yeah, of course, if you present yourself like that, being a little bit older is going to be an issue in terms of getting in, right? Especially in the sense of you may have issues, as per this last point in the first section, with hireability, right? You may not be able to get a job, and the school's going to say, this is a problem. So you have to help them mitigate that risk. You basically have to, really speak about sort of why you're getting an MBA, speak about your ability to find a job, show excellence in your career, and also show that, you're willing to interact with younger people or older people if you're comfortable with that, and you're not going to be someone who, views themselves or steps apart and sets yourself apart from your classmates. Okay, too young. We do think, by the way, that people can be too young to go to school, even if they can get in. If you're not sort of aware of what you want to do, if you're not clear how you're going to make an impact or the clubs you're going to be involved in, you may not have a rich experience at school even if you could get in. That said, you know, there are schools that basically accept undergrads, a lot of the top tier schools. So Harvard has, as you guys probably know, and women know, they have a 2+2 program where, you know, you're accepted in your senior year, you go work for 2 years, and then you do 2 years, obviously, from your MBA. There's a Yale Silver Scholars, Stanford is a program. Those are two programs where they accept you straight from undergrad. Wharton accepts people straight from undergrad. Not a huge number, but it definitely exists, okay? So, you know, being young can actually add a lot in terms of experience and value to the class, but you've got to articulate that. You've got to articulate what you're bringing to the table. But again, you may not know your focus if you're too young. What we always tell people, and sometimes it's hard because you know, we talked to some of you are very aggressive. You know what you want in your careers. You've always sort of done things first and done things early. You're not in a rush to get your MBA over with. It's not like how you might feel about college where you say, look, I just want to get this done. MBA is a little bit different, right? Because you want to go and want to interact with your classmates. You want to be able to sort of interact with professors. You want to obviously know how to comport, you know, handle yourself in a you know, respectful manner and sort of a valued way to potential employers. If you're too young, you may not have that perspective, right? Generally, we tell you find programs that are a good fit for your situation. If you're on the periphery, too young or too old, make sure your application is strong. You know you have to do a little bit more. You know you have to explain why now and, you know, and why you need an MBA, whether you're too young, quote unquote, or too old. Okay, and speak to alumni. Go to different events, reach out to alumni as well as admissions officers and get their perspective. Talk to them about it. So go to an event, meet an admissions officer, you know, tell them that he or she would love to talk to them, get to campus, and go to campus and tell them where you are. Explain to them why you're looking to apply and how you're going to add value. But you're not, it is a myth that, you know, out of the box, inherently you're too old or too young. I mean, there was a guy at class ahead of us who was 44 when he graduated. And I can think off the top of my head, my class, about 840 people at Wharton, I'm probably friends with probably about 9 people that were over the age of 34, 33, 34. So, and that's anecdotal. I'm sure there were considerably more people. So it's not necessarily an issue in itself. Okay, so, you know, yeah, you should have studied more application criteria. A low GPA is going to keep you on the top of the MBA program. This is very similar to the GMAT, okay? I would say that, though, to be totally honest with you, a low GPA is a bigger hindrance to getting to school than a low GMAT, because a low GPA is kind of, you know, at least 3 years, probably 4 years of sustained sort of mediocrity, right, or sustained issues, and it is similar to business school in terms of the things that are taxing your time. But look, you know, sometimes you go to a school and maybe you don't do well your first year, but directionally you're doing well. So that's a huge issue, okay? Potentially, you know, you may not be, you know, admissions, you do understand the difference between, you know, having a 3.1 with a major in physics versus 3.1 with a major in history or English. I'm sorry to all my English people, you know, in terms of study on the phone, but they understand that difference. Okay, so major does make a difference, as well as schools. We get calls all the time where people say, look, you know, especially international candidates, I have a you know, 81% in my school, but the top person in my class got 87%, right? My school grades very hard. School, you know, business schools are aware of that. There often are things on your transcript as well that indicate where you finished in the class. They'll sometimes reach out to a school and say, look, we're not familiar with your undergraduate institution. We have a candidate from your school applying. Can you walk us through what, you know, in the instance I just told you, an 81% means? Where did that person finish in their class? Where was the top person in that class? So you've got to have confidence in the system that they're able to understand what it means. And if you're not confident, you obviously can use your optional essay or use a recommendation to partially express that, okay? So in terms of us, make sure, you know, your GMAT is strong to help offset a low GPA. You don't want to have both that are weak, right? You'd obviously have both that are strong, but if you have a low GMAT in addition to low GPA, you're in trouble. There's no doubt about it. So you probably will either want to retake your GMAT or take the GRE and or look to, you know, take some supplemental courses as aforementioned, okay? And then you want to have your recommenders highlight your intellectual capacity and horsepower. That's very important as well in an instance where your GPA is not strong. I would tell you also, the further you are away from your undergraduate graduation date, the less impact your college grades will have on your application. So those of you on the line who are saying, look, I graduated 2-3 years ago, I had a 2.8 GPA, I would probably tell you don't apply this year, at least apply next year, because you'll have a year more work experience, assuming you're employed, where you can sort of, really stress your professional strength as opposed to your academic strength. Choosing an MBA program, all right? So we see so many myths in this arena, right? We hear people say they're all the same. They're actually not all the same, right? So full-time, part-time exec, and to be honest with you, in the last couple of years, we've also seen the rise of online MBA programs or programs that are partially online. They're all different, right? And even if you get the same degree, it's a different experience, right? So the majority of the curriculum professors are the same. The experience can be totally different, okay? So realize that, you're talking about, potentially time spent with classmates in person in terms of a full-time. You're doing it sort of all day, every day. It's immersive. Part-time, it's obviously, oftentimes evenings. Executive, it's often weekends, but it's not quite as involved. What it typically means is, interacting with people where everyone's thrown in the same environment, and most of people's social networks are based on the school, based on the classmates when they're in a full-time program versus when they're in a part-time program, people having families, people having friends outside of school, and school being one thing they do. And it's, you'll get some benefits in the sense of a part-time or executive program where you're making money still, you still have your job, but you're probably not going to graduate with the same richness and texture of relationships and friendships that you would in a full-time program. And that may or may not be important to you depending on your personality and what you want to do professionally, right? But really think about the 1 year versus 2 years, versus 2+ years if you're doing an executive MBA program, after work weekends versus dedicated time. You got to think about what you want. You also have to think about the summer internship experience, right? If you're a career changer, that can be really important. You'll find that most companies that recruit from business schools that are in the Fortune 500, they typically hire 80+% of their full-time hires come from their summer class, right? So if you're not in the summer class, it's very difficult. I mean, think about yourself as an employer. If you have, seen someone work for 10 to 12 weeks, that person knows multiple people on your team, that person has just really gone all out, busted their tail, and done a great work for you, that person's competing for a full-time spot when they graduate with someone who they don't know, who looks good on paper, who is equal on paper. Who would you choose? I mean, most of them are going to choose the person they work with. So they've worked with, rather, in the summer. So you've got to be aware of that. If you're looking to switch careers, it's probably doesn't make sense to go part-time or executive programs, especially because the admissions offices are typically geared towards helping the full-time people. They don't have jobs. They don't have employment, right? They're in a little bit more of a dire situation than those of you who are in part-time executive programs are already working now, right? So in terms of our recommendations and advantages, you have to figure out what's kind of best for you. You need to think about what are your career aspirations, what's the opportunity cost of leaving your job. Obviously, the longer you work, the more expensive it is to leave your job. And you need to think about this in that context, right? If you make $75,000 a year, to go to school is $150,000. You'll probably get $30,000 of that back over the summer. That's $120,000 off the bat, right, in terms of opportunity costs, lost income. That doesn't include, the $80,000 a year you're budgeted in terms of like room and board, tuition, trips, etc., to go to school. So going to school effectively is going to cost you that 120 plus 160, $280,000, $300,000 to get an MBA. And you've got to make sure that makes sense for you, right? You also think about your networking. Is that important? Are you switching careers? Do you want to be an entrepreneur? You say that's important. Or potentially running a family business, or you're looking to stay in the same industry, same company where you don't need that network in the same way, all right? Age and experience is very important as well in your family situation, right? So, one of my closest friends went to the Langone School, which is NYU's part-time program. He had 3 kids, actually two with one on the way, and his wife wasn't working. So for him, getting a full-time MBA, which is kind of what he really wanted to do, that just wasn't a possibility, and that's fine. I mean, people have different life situations, so you've got to be honest about that. And then you need to think about your profile. So especially if you're applying for an executive MBA program where they typically take people, they want people with 8+ years experience, maybe 7 if you're stretching it. If you're going in with 4 years of work experience and you're saying you want to do an executive MBA, you're probably not going to get in. So you've got to think about sort of how you present to the admissions committee members as well. All right. Myth number 6, and this is really MBA ranking should be the only thing determining where I apply, right? And I would say no to that. MBA rankings are really important, okay? So yeah, you look at like schools like Wharton, Harvard, Stanford, they're different schools, right? People apply to all those schools often. Typically, it's because of rankings, but they're different cultures, different sciences, urban, rural, different kinds of like teaching methodologies, slightly different perspectives on students, different placements in terms of industries and geographies. You got to think about that a little bit, right? You know, we've seen HBS as high as number 1 and as low as actually even below number 11 in rankings in the last 3 to 4 years. Now, it depends if you're looking at Wall Street Journal, Business Week, Financial Times, U.S. News and Report. There are many different ranking mechanisms, and they're all going to be different because if they were the same, they wouldn't be able to entice you to buy it because you get the same information someplace else. So you've got to keep the rankings in perspective, and you also have to think about the rankings with regards to kind of what you want to do and specialties. I would say my personal opinion is that any of the schools in the top 10, they're all pretty good schools, right? And you know, we have people all the time that say, well, I can't go to Kellogg because I want to work in finance. One of my mentors, you know, went to Kellogg and was the managing director at Lehman Brothers and Barclays and has his own, you know, $1.2 billion private equity fund doing real estate in New York City. He's a Kellogg guy, right? Which is typically marketing, general management. You know, Wharton is supposed to be finance. For many people, I mean, we're Wharton guys, we're not doing finance. You look at groups like Warby Parker, you know, that's a consumer play, right? It's a fashion play. Those guys aren't finance. So I would keep in mind that some of this is marketing, and some of this is kind of like, if you think about it, like buying luxury cars, you know, BMW, Mercedes, Audi, and Jaguar. Now, I am a BMW type guy, but the reality is they're all great cars. They're all luxury cars. Are they different? Yeah, they're somewhat different in some respects, but the reality is they share a lot more similarities. Luxury, strong engines, right? Seating capacity, you know, the construction of the car, safety records, they're very, very similar in many ways, but the marketing has to be somewhat different. So you've got to keep that in mind using that metaphor with regard to business school, okay? Fit should be important in terms of advantages, right? So fit deals with teaching style, location, you know, size, where they place people, urban, rural, you know, those kinds of things. You know, weather might be important too. We had a woman a couple years ago who was a very, very good candidate. She refused to go to any school north of Washington, D.C. She ended up going to Duke. She probably could have gone into what I would consider to be some stronger northeastern schools, but she wanted to be someplace warm because she's from California. She went to school in the South, and she'd worked in New York. She just found New York way too cold, and that was really important to her. And that's fine, okay? You want to be in a place where you've got a good fit, okay? Rankings are really important. Let's not BS ourselves and say rankings don't mean anything. They do mean something, but they're not the only factor, especially within tier. We've seen people get into Kellogg and HBS and go to Kellogg, right? Because they want to do marketing. We've seen people get into Wharton and Columbia and go to Columbia because they want to be in the city. So you've got to you have to follow your own compass, and you know, like Henry David Thoreau said, you know, every heart beats to a different drummer. So you've got to make sure that you can discover, you know, what your basically your heart is, okay? And obviously location and family support is really important as well. So you know what people say, for the guys out there, you know, happy wife, happy life, okay? So, you know, if you're not happy, and obviously it applies to women as well, if you're not happy person, you're going to have a really hard time getting the most out of your MBA experience. So go to where you think makes sense for you professionally and where you can thrive. Money, right? There's always myths about money. Elite programs are just way too expensive. You know, it's not true, right? Many times, you know, MBA programs that are the highest level, they have the most money, and they give a lot of scholarships, a lot of grants. So, you know, you have to think about it in the context of, and I do a lot of recruiting for Harvard College, and it's very analogous. I mean, Harvard College doesn't want to lose people because they can't afford it. I mean, that's why they have such a huge endowment. It's the same thing with the business school. Business schools don't want to lose you because, you know, you're saying it's too expensive. expensive. It's a little different in that you're going to business school to, most of you make more money. It's not like you're going to the school of social work. But all that said, they have endowments. They've got more money to give. Oftentimes they do really compete to get some of the top tier people. So don't be focused on that. Admissions also is need blind for most top tier business schools, meaning they'll accept you independently of whether or not they think you can pay for it. Okay? So make sure you're targeting some of these top tier schools. Realize that, business schools are partially ranked, and rankings are important to them on making sure their acceptance rate is as low as possible, but their yield is as high as possible. Yield being, the number of accepted students, the number of students that actually decide to come in the numerator over the number of accepted students in the denominator. So they want that to be as close to 1 or 100% as possible. That's very important. So once they're accepting you, oftentimes they're going to do things to try to make sure you come, especially if you're a really good candidate. It's better, we think, in terms of how we advise our candidates, apply, get in, have optionality, and then say no versus making a decision to say no up front and never applying, because you don't even know where you're going to get in the first place, right? And realize this is kind of a return on investment. A lot of you just think about, not you personally on the line, but people think about often all the money they've got to pay, but they don't think about sort of the return on invested capital, right? How quickly can you pay your loan back? Is going to school X going to give you an opportunity to break into a certain career, industry, company that you wouldn't be able to break into if you went to a school of lower stature, right? Such that you can make more money and pay that back pretty quickly, right? So in terms of advantages, there are fellowships out there. There are work-related fellowships. The investment banks have a lot of different kinds of fellowships, like Goldman, JP Morgan, Citi, et cetera. They all have fellowships, different kinds of people. People that are minority candidates or made contributions to minority communities can qualify for things like the consortium or TWIGO. There are also school-specific fellowships. I was a recipient of a Joseph Wharton Fellowship, which is for about $50,000. Oftentimes, you're given those fellowships, you apply, and they say, look, Kofi, you won this fellowship. Sometimes they notify you, we think you're a good candidate based on your background and your interest. You should apply for fellowship X, and you've got to write an essay or two to do that, right? The last thing I'm going to tell you in this instance is make sure, this is where it actually makes a difference applying round 1 or round 2. So round 1 applicants tend to have a better rate of receiving free financial aid, i.e. scholarships and grants. They don't necessarily have a better chance of getting in, but there is more free money available for round 1 versus round 2, and certainly round 2 versus round 3. So try to apply as early as you possibly can and still get in a really top-tier application. Okay? In terms of the application process, some myths out here. People think this all the time. I get it, my interview, if I kill the interview, I'm in. It's not true, unfortunately, right? So an interview is the last piece of information you submit, but it's not necessarily the last piece of information that you're evaluated on, okay? We've seen a number of candidates basically, that come to us for ding analysis, say, I don't get it, I got an interview, and I'm a great interviewee, how can I not get in? And then we look at their applications and we say, well, you had a 3.2 and basically a 680, you kind of just snuck into an interview. And even though you probably knocked their socks off, you were coming into the interview operating at a deficit. So all interviewees are not created equal in terms of going in, and an interview is not, it's just one data point, right? So just keep that in mind. It's the last thing you submit, but it's not the last piece of your candidacy in terms of being evaluated. Interviewers, we've been them. We're looking for different things in the application, right? So we want to know, certain things that we can't get from recommendations and essays and a resume, right? Things like, are you arrogant? What's your presence and maturity and your ability to communicate? Are you able to articulate a compelling and consistent narrative to what you wrote about in your essays themselves? Are you too good to be true, right? Is the application too good? I mean, it's funny. In my Wharton team, there was a guy, kid you not, that literally spoke. He's from an overseas country where English was not the first language. This guy spoke 70 words of English, and we ended up becoming pretty good friends. And although not good enough where I could ask him, who wrote your application? Because to me, there was no way you could have written this application, and schools are hip to that. So schools want to see, especially internationals, where English is not the first language spoken in your country, they want to see that basically it's consistent, right? Now we work with a lot of candidates, and it's really interesting because it's a fine line. Like a lot of times our international candidates say edit, 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 edit. And they really want us to push and almost write this stuff. When we tell them, look, we're not doing that ethically. We're not doing that because it's not good for you, even if it were ethical, because you're going to get to the interview and you're not going to be able to back the things up. You're not going to be able to communicate in the way that you're writing about. So just keep that in mind when you're applying. Okay? Make sure you practice for your interview. Tape yourself if you can. Get people to give you feedback, and be honest about the feedback. Be critical, right? It's funny. In business school, we did a communications class, and they taped us. They sort of put us like on a Today Show type set, and I found out that when I sort of did my presentations, I literally like lean over. I look like the Leaning Tower in Italy, and my posture was terrible. Right? And so you've got to get a feel. You have to be critical about this. Don't think it's okay, right? Make sure that you are basically, really paying attention to those cues that you're giving, right? Application process. How do you differentiate the second time? People always think if I'm a reapplicant, I'm at a disadvantage. Actually, you're not. For most schools, it's the exact opposite. Reapplicants tend to get in at a higher rate, right? But they are looking for growth in the last year. They are looking for you to show that, you've done some research and you're sort of more confident in your goals. They want to, reapplicants tend to do better because you've shown perseverance and sustained interest in a particular program, and schools want to see that. There's something humbling about that, which everyone appreciates humility, right? So make sure, that you are, if you're a reapplicant, make sure, you're considering applying to the same school, especially if you got interviews, but also make sure you're a better candidate, right? Read your previous application, identify areas of weakness, and work on them, right? Be real. If you apply to 5 schools in round 1, you didn't get interviews at any of them, and you're applying this year, saying, I really want to go to school this year, should you apply to only those 5 schools, or should you swap some of those schools out? Or maybe if you keep those 5, should you add more schools? I mean, you've got to be realistic. This is your sort of career, okay? And then, be very clear about how you're a better candidate over last time. And the last point is recommenders are just a checkpoint. They're actually not, right? Recommenders are really important, right? People often just sort of find recommenders, sign up online, and they give them the recommendation forms last second, so they just write something. Derek Bolton over at Stanford, that we know a little bit, he actually came out maybe 2 years ago and said, I don't really agree that most admissions officers think this, but he said recommendations are the most important piece of an application. Most people don't feel that, but they do think they're really important. So, make sure that you are getting great recommendations. Make sure that you're preparing the recommenders for what they should include with regard to experience as well as leadership characteristics. Just make sure they're prepared overall. Give them a package, resume, the schools you're looking at, why you're looking at the school, and kind of what you're looking to do in the short and long term, and what you think you can bring to the table. And really, I think equally importantly, don't ask people if they'll write you a recommendation. Ask them if they'll feel comfortable writing you a good recommendation or an excellent recommendation. And realize sometimes that cultures vary a little bit. We've had candidates coming out of certain European cultures or certain African cultures where the standard of praise is a little bit more muted. Like, in my house, it's just the way I was sort of raised. Like, my father, who's from Ghana, it's just not the culture to give a lot of praise. And if I had my father write my recommendation, which I wouldn't. I mean, if I were a person working in my dad's office and I went to my father's, can you write my recommendation? I'd be very concerned about that because it may not be effusive enough. So make sure you're taking that into account. All right? Before we get to questions, people always ask us, we have a number of different application support packages, pre-application package if you are applying in 6+ months. We've got a full service package if you basically want soup to nuts, unlimited help. And we've got hourly, final review. We've got a lot of different things on our website. So go take a look if you're interested or shoot me an email. Applications are coming pretty soon. It sounds weird, but September's not that far away, so get on it. If you're ready, get on it. If you're not ready, that means you have to take your GMAT courses and you get started with that, okay? Even if you're going to make round 2, I would submit to you that you need to sort of start really strongly planning now, right? We've got a lot of good webinars coming up. We definitely invite you to come. We're going to be doing Stanford pretty soon. We're going to be doing one of our favorite ones, candidate success stories, people who sort of came out of nowhere and got into school. I think that's always pretty inspiring for people, and they're real people we've worked with, which is kind of fun. We're on Facebook, we're on Twitter. I hate our blog, but check it out if you want. We'll actually be redesigning that pretty soon. And if you haven't had a consultation, a free one, and you want one, Eric and I, the two founders, we try to do all of them. So sign up on sketch.me/admitadvantage or email me at kkankam@admitadvantage.com or give us a call. So there are lots of ways to get in touch with us. Okay, and with that, let's get some questions. No question's a bad question. I will also keep you anonymous, and I'll just refer to you as using your initials. Okay, so please type in some questions, and we'll do about 8 to 12 minutes worth of questions. Okay. Question: do I need to convert my med school grades to a GPA? We didn't have GPA system in our school, or would the B schools themselves convert my transcript into a GPA? So both, right? So you do want to make an attempt to convert that. There are mechanisms out there. There's World Education Services online. You can Google that. They convert a lot of different kinds of GPAs and grades into 4.0 GPAs. If you didn't have a system, I wouldn't worry about it, because the sending your transcript to business schools would do it for you anyway. Please provide information about the TOEFL. Well, the TOEFL varies school to school, but you need to do well in that. TOEFL's for people basically where English is not their first language. All the schools give you a range for the scores. I would say that the TOEFL becomes more important if you are working in a culture. Let's say you didn't go to a school where English was the first language, but you work in a company where you're conducting business in English. That certainly lessens the impact of what the TOEFL is. But most of you that need the TOEFL are not coming from places where English is the first language, so you're working in those industries where English is the first language, so you need to learn the TOEFL. I will also say that the verbal section of the TOEFL gives the verbal section of the GMAT rather is another data point that admissions officers use to sort of understate the impact of the TOEFL. So the TOEFL's not it's not the only thing that's important, but it is quite important in itself. All right. Question. This will be a little long one. I graduated and started working right after that on August 12. Right now it's almost 24 months. If I apply for August 15 sessions, does my experience count as 2 years or 3 years? 3 years. That's a good question. So when you look at MBA sites and they say the average work experience heading into school is X, they mean from the time that someone graduated undergraduate to the time they matriculated. They do not mean from the time someone started undergraduate to the time they submitted their application. So that's correct. If you graduate in 2012 and you're applying this fall and you start next year, the business schools will look at you as having 3 years of experience, okay, when you start. Although obviously the set of experiences that you're drawing from in your application will only be 2 years. So you only have 2 years to be promoted. You only have 2 years to sort of get certain kinds of responsibility in your job, etc. But yes, you will be considered having 3 years of experience. Okay, question. I left my job to prepare for the GMAT. I'm planning to give my GMAT by August. How do I present this time period of 2 to 3 months to the business school? Carefully, right? So I'll be honest with you. I don't think that's a really good idea to quit your job to prepare for business schools, because business schools are going to say, well, you can't multitask. You have to multitask in that way in school. So I would explain your logic for why you did it, but I would also tell you that you certainly need to be doing things outside of just preparing for business school. So volunteering for 15 to 20 hours a week, working in a local religious institution, starting a business, doing some kind of consulting work. You need to show that you're doing things to further your skill set and professionalism and what you're bringing to the table, as opposed to just sort of taking time out to only work on your application. Okay, another question. If I have a career change and I'm still young to apply to business school. Should my work experience be focused on my initial career option or towards the change I'm trying to bring in? Well, it depends on how long you work in your new career. I mean, I'd say that's kind of a false question. It's a question based on a faulty premise. I mean, if you just switch careers and you're looking to apply this fall, then you're going to have to write about mostly about kind of what you've done, in the last 2+ years, because between now and the fall is only a couple months, right? But if you, let's say you switch jobs now and you're applying in 2015, you apply in fall 2015 to start fall 2016, then what you write about next fall can be more so based on your career switch. So the timing is really important, kind of how you do that. Question: if I wanted to take the GMAT in July plus study for TOEFL, will I make it for round 1 this year? Maybe. Yeah, you'll probably make it for a couple schools. Maybe certainly. Well, look, it depends on how long you need to study for TOEFL. I mean, that's kind of an individual thing. It depends on when you're taking the GMAT in July. I mean, round 1 in schools, right? Round 1s are typically sort of mid-September to mid-October. You will probably be able to get out, I suspect, if you're like most candidates, 2 schools. I think more than that, 3+ might be kind of tricky. But again, it depends on the schools, because some schools apply to HBS, it's 1 essay. While some other schools still have 4 or 5 essays. Apply to NCI, you're looking at like 7 essays, right? 6 or 7, so it kind of varies. Another question: I'm planning to take my GMAT in mid-August. When should I start writing my essay? Well, probably after you take your GMAT. I mean, and I say it probably because it's hard to say. Most people do better if they do their GMAT prep, GMAT exam, and work on their essays and applications sequentially as opposed to simultaneously, right? Most people find it very hard to do well in their job, do well in their GMAT, and submit really good essays and entire applications all while working on all those things at the same time. So obviously, taking your GMAT in August means, and if you wait to work on your applications, means that you're probably going to get in fewer schools in round 1. But the alternative is basically working on your essays, taking your GMAT in August, not doing it while on your GMAT, and then what do you do, right? Because you probably don't want to submit, then you're probably going to submit round 2 anyway, because you're not going to submit your application with terrible scores. So you've got to think that through a little bit, but I probably would say, yeah, at that point I'd still do it sequentially and just do round 2 if you have to. Okay, question. I got a 35% raise after 1 year into work, which is quite high compared to my peers. The promotion criteria, however, is tenure-based. That doesn't form a pillar for me. How do I mention such a thing in my essay without sounding obnoxious? You mentioned that you got a 35% raise. You can mention that in your essays. I mean, I think it depends on the type of essays. And I definitely think that's something that you should have your recommenders mention, right? Assuming you're going to have a recommendation from your job, you should ask your recommender if he or she will basically mention the fact that you got a pretty substantive raise and are kind of at the top of your peer group and are tracking well to be promoted, in the next promotion cycle, but that your promotion cycles at your job are pretty rigid. Okay, next question. Will the career break of a year due to childbirth reduce my chance of getting into top MBA programs? I didn't do anything significant during this time, just taking care of the baby and learning photography, baby. Well, it's pretty funny. Actually, I have a 9-month-old, so I've got some empathy on that. But that said, I think the answer is yes. Unfortunately, that will have a little bit of a deleterious impact. So I think unless you are talking about, unless you basically are talking about sort of a difficult sort of pregnancy, right? Then I think it will be tricky for you. I think if you're talking about typical, and it's unfortunate, right? I actually had numerous discussions with my wife on this in a lot of different dimensions, but I think if you're talking about, having a baby and then going beyond the typical 3 or 4 months of sort of maternity leave and staying home for the additional 8 to 9 months, I think most schools they won't look at it negatively, but you have to think about the fact that you're probably competing against people that also have babies and have families, and some of those women went back to work. Now, going back to work, quote unquote, can also mean working from home. It can mean starting your own business. It can mean sort of, starting a blog. It can mean doing consulting. I think there are lots of things you can do, but there is, if you want to get into the most competitive schools, having a year where you're not building yourself professionally right before you apply will definitely hurt you. I mean, unfortunately, it's not my rule, but I think that's probably an accurate analysis. All right. What is the evaluation of IR in top schools? It's funny, I was just at a Association of Independent Graduate Admissions Consultants, and we were at Columbia, and I won't quote him, but one of the admissions officers basically said the IR doesn't really matter that much. We're not sure how to look at it. It's still fairly new. If all the other stuff is good, the IR doesn't really matter. I think that probably applies to most schools. It's still too new. They're not, one of the things that's going to have to happen is, in order for them to put value in the IR, is they're going to map the IR to people's IR scores to how well they do in business school, and then how well they do professionally. And then in business school, they'll be able to say, okay, if someone got a IR of 8, whatever, they basically typically were in this band of GPA, so it matters. Right now, they don't have enough of that data to sort of make that determination. All right. What is the definition of a bad GMAT score, especially for someone who's been out of school for more than 6 years? Well, I think the real question is, what schools are you targeting, right? So if you're targeting, it's not necessarily a bad score. I think the better question is, what is the definition of a non-competitive or uncompetitive GMAT score? If you look at sort of top-tier school, I'd say generally anything 40 points off the mean puts you in a place where you're working from a real deficit. So if the mean of the school is 725, at 680, 685, anything below that, you're at a severe deficit. But if the school is if you're looking at a different school, let's say like a Babson, where the mean might be about 660, and you get basically a 650, that's obviously a pretty good score for Babson. So I think it depends on the kind of school. All right. How beneficial are class visits versus a campus visit? Is enough to make you wait until round 2? No, I wouldn't say that. So I will say, though, it depends on your location. If you were in New York, for where I happen to live, we've had people do this, which blows my mind. If you're in New York and you're applying to like Columbia and NYU and you haven't visited the schools, that's a problem, right? Because they're going to question how serious you're about a particular program. And you can substitute being in New York for being in Chicago and looking at Kellogg and Booth and not visiting. So it kind of depends. If you're international, it means less. It's not as important, although it is a point you can use to stand up. But I would stand out with people, obviously. Admissions members realize that this is, expensive. But it is, if you can do it, you should do it. But it's not something that's going to keep you out. Okay, what is the best tool to improve in the GMAT from 500 to 600 or 650? I mean, there are lots of tools. I mean, you say tools, you're talking about company. I think there are different companies. I'd say the big ones are Princeton Review, Kaplan, Manhattan GMAT. Obviously Beat the GMAT has a number of different partners. So, you can sort of look at the partners that are represented on the site. They're typically some of the big players. I think the question for you is, do you use a class? Do you use like the GMAT tool? Do you use, sort of the online test prep tool? Do you actually have an individual tutor? So I break it into sort of, on your own, just sort of doing practice problems, getting a book, versus, being in a class, versus, using sort of an online virtual program. And I think, there are pros and cons to each of them, and obviously the money expense is different. But generally, I would say one-on-one help is probably the best way to one-on-one help from someone who knows what they're doing is probably the best way to improve your score. What are some acceptable sources for recommendations outside of employers? I think potentially other senior people in your company that maybe are not your direct boss, but people that basically have seen your work. If you have to get out of your company as a whole, I think suppliers. I think vendors that you may work with. I think potentially clients. I think those are the groups that I choose from. I would not choose peers unless you're directly asked, like the Stanford application. All right, so I'll take one more question, and then we'll call it. Any more questions? It's like an auction. Once, twice. Okay, sold. So I want to thank you guys and women for attending. I hope you guys found it helpful. And, you know, realize that you've got to get out there and get information, but you have to be smart enough to figure out what seems to resonate as truthful and what seems to be something that's just kind of an old wives' tale. Okay, usually not done with, you know, any kind of sort of ill intent, but just sort of things that people have heard that are sort of spinning out there. So hopefully you found this webinar helpful in that sense. I definitely encourage you to sign up for consultations and take a look at our site to see if there are any offerings. The consultation's free, so I would, you know, typically I always say take advantage of something free if you think it's good, if you don't think it's good. But regardless, we wish you the best of luck, and we hope to see you at some of these other webinars we have coming up, which are posted on our website, and also with Beat the GMAT next month. All right, have a good one. Bye.